Welcome to Coffee and Divination, a podcast about the arts of obtaining hidden knowledge in changing times. Join me, Joanna Farrar, to chat with experts from around the world on tarot, runes, geomancy, and the many ways divination can help us navigate and plan our paths ahead. So I'm very, very thankful to have Sam back on the program. For those of you who don't know his work, he is a fantastic and renowned geomancer. That is his claim to fame among many others, and he spoke about that in our first podcast interview. He is a scholar of Hermetic magic. He is a Lukumi priest. He is a Renaissance man who wears many hats. He is an author who has published many excellent ebooks, including his most recent, which is Preces Templi. And those are all available for purchase on his website, which is Digital Ambler. If you don't know the Digital Ambler, you really should check it out. It is a fantastic source of information, and there are so many rabbit holes that you can be pulled down on that wonderful site. So I highly recommend checking it out. And I am really looking forward to our second conversation here today. So thank you, Sam.
Thank you. It's great to be back. I'm thrilled that your show has been doing so fantastically over the past year. Like, congratulations on that. Like, hands down, running a podcast with interviews like this is not easy, and you've done amazing work. And gosh, that's a litany of praise I don't deserve, but thank you.
No, most definitely you do. But so we are here to talk today about a subject that I'm very fascinated with, and I feel like it deserves more attention than it gets, although I think it's gaining in popularity, and you are a good portion of the reason why a lot of people know about it. I read about it on your website as well, which is the practice of divination by alphabet, specifically the Greek alphabet in this case. And I believe that, were you the one that coined the term grammatomancy?
Pretty sure I did, yes.
Okay.
So
I thought so.
I should not get all the praise. Probably shouldn't get most of the praise for spreading the good word, the Greek alphabet oracle. The Greek alphabet oracle is how it's generally referred to in the wider community. And I learned about it from the Bibliotheca Arcana website maintained by John Opsopaus. Opsopaus. Like, I constantly mess up his last name. I feel so bad about that. It's an old website. Like, it's still online. It's still actively updated. It's a fantastic example of like pre-millennium web design. Like, it's simple, it's clean, it's clear. I kind of miss those days. But on that website, John Opsopaus, writing under his old pen name Apollonius Sophistus, wrote about the Greek alphabet oracle, and he provided his own translation of this series of oracular messages that were originally in Greek. He has since published his own book, The Oracles of Apollo, by John Opsopaus.
I have my copy as well. Love that.
Exactly. And it has, his version of the Greek alphabet oracle, which he has since updated and elaborated on from his original writing on his website. It also includes his own version of the Delphic oracle and so forth, using the Delphic maxims. But so his website is where I originally got wind of this Greek alphabet oracle as well. And then I looked into his sources. I kind of took it and then kind of elaborated in my own ways in the years. And because I like having Greek words for everything, instead of calling it Greek alphabet oracle, I guess I did maybe coined the term grammatomancy, or grammatomanteia in Greek, literally divination by letters, because that's what it is, divination using the letters of the Greek alphabet.
Yeah, and it's a term that, as you said, you kind of coined in order to speak most specifically about the Greek alphabet oracle, and the ways in which that was used in ancient times and now today. But there are examples of other sort of alphabet oracles as well. I mean, people are familiar with runes to a degree. The Ogham could be considered that. I mean, they're all things that have letters that are given associations that people divine by. But the Greeks are kind of unique in that we know for a fact that they practice this divination. I mean, there's debate on the runes and other things like that. A lot of it is reconstruction of one kind or another.
Exactly.
But with the Greeks, we have source material. So can you tell us a little bit about how we know about it and things like that?
So when we say ancient Greeks or the ancient Greece as a whole, like that's a shorthand. Like, in reality, there wasn't a unified ancient Greek people. You know, for one, they had their own empires, they had their own colonies across the entire Aegean and across the Mediterranean more broadly. And each individual, city state, each individual, parent child relationship between a city and its colony, they all had their own individual cultures, to the point where each individual city state might have their own calendar, which is actually honestly a astounding thing for us modern people to think about. But really, each individual, you know, city state, land, country had its own separate culture. And we typically think of Athens being the center point of it all. In reality, it wasn't, but we do have the most historical data from Athens. Size of Athens like the size of like a small county, really, in the United States.
Mhm.
So the Greek alphabet oracle comes from a few archaeological inscriptions of a couple of pillars over in Asia Minor, which today is Turkey, which was also heavily colonized by the Greeks back in the ancient period. And in a certain place, which also had the name Olympus, not to be confused with Olympus in Greece, but this is a separate Olympus in Turkey, what is now Turkey. There's this pillar, which is its own little kind of like own little ruins area, but it used to be kind of like a marketplace, a forum kind of area, if I recall correctly. And on this pillar, you had 24 different inscriptions, each line starting off with a different letter of the Greek alphabet, kind of like an acrostic. And each message was a different oracle. So all you had to do essentially was have a bowl of pebbles, each pebble inscribed the different letter of the Greek alphabet. Make your petition to the gods, ask your question, reach into the bowl, draw a letter out at random, and then you have a letter on that pebble and you just match that letter to whatever's on the pillar. So for instance, if you drew a letter and let's say you got pi, our modern day p, the oracle associated with that would be polus agonas Dionysus lepse stephos. Finishing many contests, you will seize the crown. So that'd be this oracle associated with pi, because the first letter of that message is polus, many. So let's say, oh, I'm really struggling with my crops this year. How am I to make a profit out of it? And you drew this oracle. Finishing many contests, you will seize the crown. Try again. You may fail again this year. You may have a hard time this year with your crops, but keep trying. You will eventually become successful. You will eventually achieve that crowning glory of having a successful farm. And you could take that approach with all 24 oracular messages. And at the core of it, that's all it is. Unlike runes, where each letter stood for a certain symbol, or ogham similarly, the letters weren't really related to symbols per se, but words that started off a message. And I think that's a crucial difference between, Greek alphabet oracle versus Nordic runes.
Mhm.
So, sorry.
So yeah, and so that's very interesting. And so we have some record of those stones that give those oracular statements that someone would be able to reference. And we know that this was probably practiced in other places besides obviously where those ruins were found. What I am interested in knowing is there are I think there are two sources of this information, and sometimes they conflict. Is that something that
It's not well attested outside this area.
Mhm.
Like, if it was practiced more broadly throughout Turkey or throughout the Aegean or throughout Greece, we don't have evidence of it. We know it's practiced at least in this tiny little part. And for us modern people who just need another form of divination, that's all we really need.
Mhm.
Um, we don't know the exact spread. But yes, there are different versions of the alphabet oracle. Largely, they do coincide with more or less the same messages for the letters.
Mhm.
But they do have some differences where one oracular message may be a different statement entirely, so may have a different value of meaning, or it might just be a subtle difference in wording. But largely, they're kind of the same. What
Mhm.
is interesting is that there's a related oracle using knuckle bones. And for that, I would also recommend the book Oracle Bones Divination by Kostas Stervanis, which, using that divination, you have 4 knuckle bones, astragaloi. and you roll them, and you get a certain numerical result. 1, 3, 4, 4, for instance. 1, 3, 4, 4, 4, 1, 3, 4, 4, 6, 5 knuckle bones. And again, on a pillar or like on some text nearby, you would have, I think it's 56 different combinations of the knuckle bones, each of which it's not a single statement, but it's more like a paragraph, a series of 3 or 4 verses that give you an oracle. What's interesting about this is that many of the individual sentences in the knucklebones divination appear in the alphabet divination system. Um, Additionally, you could also roll the 4 knucklebones. Well, sorry, 5 knucklebones. Keeping 4 and 5 times mixed up. It's been a day. And you can sum them up. So 1, 3, 4, 4, 4 is what, 16? If you count up the total number of possibilities of rolling 5 knucklebones, you can get a total of 24 different results, one for each of the Greek letters.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting and weird. I don't know what the scholarship currently says on it. It may be that the Greek alphabet oracle came first and then was expanded into using knucklebones, or maybe knucklebones came first and it was reduced into alphabet oracles. It depends. I'm not entirely certain. But there is definitely a connection, and you can certainly work them both at the same time.
I have a set of knuckle bones, which I really enjoy using as divination.
It's fantastic. It's what I personally prefer when I'm working with Hermes or the other Greek gods.
Mhm.
And obviously a lot of people nowadays can't go out and just get a pair of sheep, ritually slaughter them, and then save the knuckle bones afterwards. Instead, what you can do if you're interested is to get a set of 2 sets of Mongolian shagai, which are sheep knuckle bones used for gaming. Just one set has 4 pieces. You need 5 bones in order to do this form of divination, so 2 sets.
Mm-hmm. And I remember seeing that there are sculptures and things in artwork that shows that obviously it was also used for gaming, like you said, like these knuckle bones were very, very common gambling or dice game or things like that. So it's
And we see the
like
same
with
thing
many forms
today.
of divination, it can be both.
We have modern dice divination. We have playing card divination. Exactly. And it's interesting because Hermes is the god of divination, and he's the trickster god.
Mhm.
So he's the god of sortilege, of casting lots, of placing bets, of gambling, of gaming. It's all kind of tied in his own little domain. So it's kind of fascinating to see the connections there.
Mm-hmm. So there is also with the Greek letters, I want to go into talking about like dice divination and things like that and how you think about that and what you do with that. But going back to the letters themselves of the Greek alphabet, there's a whole tradition also that is present around the Greek conceptions of the letters that goes beyond just those 24 statements that we had those, few attestations for in Turkey. There's also what is the word? Stoicheia.
Yes.
Stoicheia, or elements. And I believe that breaks down the letters into different categories. And that takes us spiraling into all sorts of different associations of the different letters with planets and all sorts of other stuff. I was wondering if you could help us dive in a little bit to that.
So the way I consider it, let's take a step back and kind of start from a higher level for digging in deeper. A Greek letter can be said to have 5 different parts. You have the name letter, alpha, beta, gamma, and so forth. You have the sound that the letter makes, b, g, d, and so forth. You have the form of the letter, actually what it looks like when you write it out. You have the number associated with that letter, basically numerology. Alpha is 1, beta is 2, gamma is 3, iota is 10, and so forth. And then you have the symbolism of the letter. You could tie the oracular messages into that symbolism letter. There's a whole series of myths and other folk traditions that associate certain animals or certain plants to certain letters, oftentimes based on what the name of that plant or animal starts with. And you also have stoicheia. Stoicheia does mean elements, so that's a plural word. So the singular is stoicheion. And the way I prefer to use the word stoicheia is in what the elemental, zodiacal, or planetary associations of the letters are. And at this point, it kind of sounds like it's starting to get into Kabbalistic influence. And it kind of is, kind of isn't. It kind of raises the question of where, Kabbalah even got the associations to begin with. I'm not going to make such claims anytime soon about which is old or not. But consider in the Greek alphabet, you have 7 vowels: alpha, epsilon, eta, iota, omicron, upsilon, and omega. Even from an ancient time, at least the Roman Empire, if not much older, there's association of matching these 7 letters, these 7 vowels, to the 7 planets. Oftentimes it's alpha with the moon, epsilon with Mercury, eta with Venus, iota with the sun, and so forth. But that's just 7 letters out of the 24 total of the Greek alphabet. And you can divide up letters into different groups. There's different ways based on which author, which philosopher you're reading. I asked for a relatively recent way, which is printed in Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. This is kind of a weird mix of mixing classical stuff with Renaissance stuff, and generally I caution against that, but I find that this works really well for me. If you take out the vowels, you have consonants. And you have, 17 consonants left after you move the vowels. You can break the 17 consonants out into a group of 12 simple consonants and 5 complex consonants. A simple consonant is like beta or delta or gamma, a single sound. A complex consonant is like psi or chi, literally a K plus an H sound, or a P plus an S sound. So a complex consonant is literally 2 sounds, or a different sound that's not as simple as the rest. Nowadays, like for instance, theta is pronounced th, a single sound. But classically, it was literally a T and an H, a T, a breathy T sound. So it's something to bear in mind when you're kind of approaching the Greek alphabet from a modern standpoint. So we have 12 simple consonants and 5 complex consonants. Well, the 12 simple consonants, well, there are 12 zodiac signs. So associate them in order. Beta gets associated with Aries, Gamma with Taurus, Delta with Gemini, and so on. The 5 complex consonants get associated with the elements. So Theta with Earth, Psi with Water, Chi with Fire, Phi with Air, and Psi with Spirit or Quintessence. I personally don't consider it an element per se, at least not like how fire, air, water, earth are. But it's not a planet. It's not a zodiac sign. It's effectively, for the purposes of the system of divination, an element. So by associating the letters of the Greek alphabet with the planets, the zodiac signs, and the elements, we now have a key of plugging these individual letters in to much more cosmic forces. The gods of each sign or planet, the plants and animals associated with each sign or planet or element. And that's where you can really get into some really interesting stuff. For instance, it's common to kind of just do numerology on a name. Like if you have the name Maria, well, you have those 5 letters: mu, alpha, rho, iota, alpha. You sum them up, you get a number. You can do all sorts of analysis on that number, the sum from the vowels, the sum from the consonants, and so forth. But with Stoicheia, you can also associate individual forces to those letters and see, is this person planet dominated? Are they star dominated? Are they element dominated? Are they cool or are they hot based on the temperature or the moisture associated with the forces associated with those letters? It gets really deep, really complex, really quickly, but it really profoundly just deepens the whole system, something that's really grand in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, those numbers break down very evenly and in a way that really makes sense. So it's very easy to associate with each of those letters in a way that is easy to reference. So that is an excellent system. And it harkens back, like you were saying, it also kind of points to the numerology, although that's the word is not as exact, but like you mentioned in one of your posts how there were the systems of characterizing numbers as letters or associating numbers specifically with letters. That was, of course, part of Hebrew systems as well as the Greeks. Mm-hmm. And that is, try it, isopsephy?
Yes, isopsephy. Or isopsphia, if you want to use the Greek term. Mm-hmm. And the way that word came around, it literally means equal pebble or equal accounting. Mm-hmm. Think of our word calculus. Well, the root of the word calculus comes from Latin calx, meaning a small pebble, because back in the day, people did counting or tallying up by allocating little pebbles to certain piles. Same kind of notion in Greek, where isopsophia equal pebbles. If you have a certain number of pebbles, it equals a certain number. So if you tally up the numbers of certain letters, you get a certain sum. And that, God, isopsophia is so talked about in a whole slurry of different texts. Um, there's a great book, I don't have it at hand right now, The Greek Kabbalah by Kieran Barry. Another fantastic text that really goes into the history of how the ancients, especially in classical Greece and Roman period Greece and Hellenistic period and so forth, whether it's Christian or Gnostic or pagan, how they interpreted what the number symbolism of all these letters were, or even the shapes of the letters. And again, that adds whole different depths as well, alongside the oracular symbolism, the stoichaic, symbolism, and so forth.
Mhm. So then you can go through and you can analyze different phrases or different names of God using these various systems and see what that gets you.
Exactly. And like just how nowadays we have whole systems of numerology to like determine, how long a person will live, what their kind of life will be, what their life goal will be. The ancient Greeks did exactly that and more. Like there are all sorts of books and texts that talk about different divination systems about if you have person A and person B and they get into a fight, who will win based on their name. Or, if person A is going to get married to person B, how will their marriage turn out? Again, based on their names. Or if a certain person falls sick, based on the number of the lunar day plus the number of their name, what will the illness be like? Will they recover quickly? Will they not recover at all? Will they die? Will they, live but with impediments? You can tell all that sort of information. And they had really complicated forms of analysis along these lines back in the day, which we have ample evidence of and can still use quite handily. The only question is, how do you write a name in Greek?
Well, yes.
And that's a whole different problem.
And yes, making these things then fit into contexts with translation and all of that is a whole other ball of wax, I'm sure. And then there's also some of this then relates to, I believe, a related system of numerology, the Pithmenes or the thrones.
Yes. So there were different analyses done, and Pithmenes literally roots or thrones. So just how nowadays, let me back up. When we count numbers today, we use Arabic numerals. So we have a place value system. In the rightmost period, we have ones. In the second place, we have tens. We have hundreds and thousands and so forth. The ancient Greeks didn't use that kind of number system. They had Greek numbers, which were basically using the letters as numerals. So if you wanted to write the number, say, 144, 12 squared, you would have the numeral for 100, and you have the numeral for 40, and you have the numeral for 4. So you have 100 plus 40 plus 4. That's the sum of those three numbers, three letters, I suppose, in this case. But with Pithmenes, you don't consider the magnitude of the number. The Pithmenes of 100 is just 1. The Pithmenes of 40 is just 4. So in that case, alpha, 1, iota, 10, and rho, 100, all resolved down to 1. In other words, we see this system still used today, even in modern numerology systems. If you have a number over, 10, you just add the digits up, and then that's kind of your sum for the roots of that word. Same kind of system, same deal. And there were other systems that use this as opposed to just looking at the sum, the naive sum, I guess you can call it, of the letters as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that then relates into some Pythagorean ideas of number and
It goes on and on and on. And honestly, I wish I had more time to actually get deeper into the numerology stuff. I'll be honest, I don't like using numerology in general.
Mhm.
I know a lot of people do great analyses with it, and I'm not, trying to dissuade anyone from going to them, for analyses, for help, for advice, and so forth. But something about it, it lacks the depth that, say, astrology have, in my experience. And it's kind of the same level as like, palm reading. Your palm is just your hand. You're born with it. It doesn't change. Likewise, your name doesn't change over the course of life, unless you actually willingly choose to change your name for any various reasons. Which there's a debate over whether you should use your chosen name, your birth name. I'm not going to get into that. It's a headache in so many different ways. But I want to do more research in numerology and how the ancient Greeks considered it and used it. But I would rather stick to the more the Stoichaic stuff personally for my own practice. I just seem to get more out of it that way.
Yeah.
But even though that's my modern take on it, it's definitely much more common ancient times to use the numerology for divination, like proper divination. So
I think, yeah, no, I agree with you. I think it's interesting to me, especially to see it as another facet of how many layers of meaning and how many ways that the Greek letter system was used. And I'm sure other linguistic systems also had that kind of embedded depth that was expected in it that we kind of have lost sight of because we don't really think of. I mean, the lettering system that we use today, I think you had a blog post on how no one, has anyone come up with something that would work with like our modern English language? Because I know.
I don't like it. I don't like using the Roman alphabet in any of its forms, whether it's used for English or German or Icelandic, whether you want to consider accented letters as separate letters or double letters, like in Spanish, ella, if you want to use that as a separate letter, like I find lots of problems using the Roman script that just aren't there using the Greek script. Some people do use, their own English, sort of numerology. I know the Thelemites have one, other groups have others. Good for them. I'm not going to say anything about them because they know what they're doing. I don't. I just don't feel so great doing it.
Mhm.
Your amount may vary.
Yeah, and the Greek system does have an enormous amount, like you're saying, with the Stoicheia, with if you want to use the 24 statements that we have that went with the letters themselves as a simple form. It's very effective. I mean, myself and my coven, we have adopted sometimes using that Oracle of Apollo method of work, and it is remarkably effective, especially when you are working specifically with deities, that may have been used to these types of divination. So
That's actually one of the really neat things because using the knuckle divination, each cast of the knuckle bones has its own little oracular paragraph. And it also has a separate god associated with each throw as well.
mm-hmm.
But using Stoicheia, if you just want to stick to the Greek alphabet oracle and those 24 messages, those 24 letters, using Stoicheia, you can also associate individual gods to each of those forces. So, for instance, again, I'm going to turn to Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books called Philosophy. In his second book, he gives an Orphic scale of 12, basically a correspondence table that uses 12 different columns, each one being associated with one of the zodiac signs. He also associates each zodiac sign with a different Greek god. Aries with Athena, Aries with Athena, Taurus with Aphrodite, Gemini with Apollo, and so forth. So we have zodiac signs and gods equated. The planets, obviously, it's easy to find gods associated with those. The elements, we also have classical sources that associate, say, Hades with fire, Zeus with air, Hera with air, Persephone with water, Hades with fire, and Zeus. Sorry, Hera's earth, Zeus is air. Got this mixed up. I apologize. But yeah, so you can associate each of those letters with a different deity,
Mm-hmm.
and you can expand that into notions of courts of that deity. So, for instance, Apollo is famous for being the leader of the Muses. So he also associated the Muses with Apollo, and therefore also with Gemini.
Mm.
Zeus, one of the most famous myths about Zeus about his, cupbearer Ganymede. So you could also associate Ganymede with Zeus and that sign and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So you can have like whole ideas of what god do I need to propitiate in order to fix this problem. Draw a letter, get a god. It's pretty straightforward, actually, and it's really elegant in its own simple way.
Yeah. So that was actually going to tie into one of my next questions, which is when you are working with this as a divination system, what are some of the ways? I mean, do you have a set of, personally, I've made my own set of stones, and that's what I draw from. And then that's just the way that I reference it. But I know that there are other ways of doing that, like with dice, if you don't have a set or things like that, which you describe. What is your go-to method?
So it kind of depends the context. If I'm at my shrines where I actually have my gods situated, where I make offerings and so forth, I have a set of dedicated knuckle bones I've specifically consecrated to Hermes there.
Mm-hmm.
And I use that for all the Greek gods because Hermes is the messenger of all the Greek gods. So it makes sense. I can use knuckle bones outside of context, but I have a set of essentially tabletop role-playing dice I already use for various kinds of divination. And I use specifically the D12, the dodecahedron, the 12-sided die for Greek letter divination. And the way I use it, it's kind of subtle. I take one die and I roll it twice. The Greek alphabet has 24 letters. So I divide that into first half and second half. The first roll of the die tells me which half should I be looking at. If it's odd, I look at the first half. If it's even, I look at the second half. The second roll of the die tells me which of those 12 letters in that half I pick. So if I roll a 9 and a 3, well, that's odd for the first roll, so I look at the first half. And then a 3 is the third letter of that first half. So that's gamma in this case. But I also flip the numbers as well to get a secondary letter, a kind of hidden letter, to kind of get like a background context. Mm. So if I roll a 9 and a 3, well, that gets me gamma for the upfront explicit letter. But if I flip those, I get 3 and 9. So that's the 9th letter of the first side, which would be Yoda? Alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, zeta, eta, theta, Yoda. Yeah, Yoda. So that'd be like the implicit letter, the hidden subtext of what's going on.
I see. That's very, very interesting.
But that's just me using a 12-sided die because I'm a nerd. So another classical way of doing this is just getting a bowl of pebbles and just marking each one with a different letter. Like completely traditional. You use pebbles, you use potsherds, you use slips of paper. Doesn't really matter. Mm-hmm. And it's just drawing letters out of a bowl. Simple, straightforward, don't need to count, don't need to tally anything up. It's easy that way.
It does keep it very simple, which I like.
You just keep a little, it's like some of my Nordic pagan friends, they keep a satchel of runes on them. This, when they need guidance, they just draw one out at random. You can do the same thing with this.
I was traveling for performances. I was on tour and I forgot my set of runes. So I just made scraps of paper and then had like little teeny scraps of a scrap of paper set of runes that I always kept in my violin case. So
just in case.
Just in case, just pick a little piece of paper. It absolutely helps. That was before I heard about the Oracle of Apollo. So I don't do as much traveling due to COVID these days.
Yeah, no one is.
But yes, I think it's very elegant in its simplicity, but as you pointed out, when you go into the Stoicheia, when you go into all these other forms of it, it has an enormous amount of complexity and depth that you can pull from it. One of the things that I wanted to talk to you about that kind of it relates to many of these concepts is the relations between these letters and time. The calendars of if we're going to talk about the Greeks, we're really talking about the Attic calendar. We're talking about Athenian stuff because that's what we have the most evidence for. But yeah, I know, and you are taking a deep breath. I know that the calendar stuff and all of that work, your books on this are fantastic. They're amazing resources. I don't expect you to try to describe all of this in a podcast interview. But the lunar calendar or the calendar of the Greeks is very different from obviously our modern way of conceptualizing time, both in the 24-hour system as well as like calendrically our month system. Could you just kind of give people a brief rundown for some people who may be listening that aren't as familiar with that?
Brief. Okay, so I do have to give a disclaimer for this. I mentioned earlier how each individual city-state had their own calendar, and that's true. When I was looking into ancient Greek ways of timekeeping and chronology, I found this one multi-volume encyclopedic work on all the different calendars they had, all the different ways of reckoning time, civic and religious and farming across all areas of ancient Greece that we have evidence for. It's a mess. Yes, when we consider the ancient Greek calendar, we generally refer to the Attic one. It's true. But again, every city state had its own calendar. If the Attic ones became popular, let's be honest, it was through colonization. That's why. Yes, there was the Olympiad system of treating years, but that also wasn't always followed. It's a good way to kind of standardize things across all Greek history, but like as far as Athens, you named years after the archons in power. Like it really was complicated to keep time, to keep track of time. And I initially wanted to use the idea of a lunisolar calendar. So the ancient Greeks used the moon as a marker of time, generally being the key word. There's never a definite answer for this. But they started the new moon, the day after the syzygy between the moon and the sun, so the first appearance of the moon. And you had months of 29 or 30 days, give or take. And that would give you a year of 12 or 13 months because they aligned it with the summer solstice, generally. And so if you were kind of like several weeks short, you threw an intercalary month to kind of make up the difference. And I used that originally as a basis for a Greek letter calendar. I looked at this, I tried using it, and it did work until I realized some major flaws in how I was considering it, unfortunately. So I threw out the whole Atticness of it and just started from scratch using my own astrological influence system. But it's still a lunisolar calendar. The basics are still more or less the same. So when I use this Greek letter calendar, well, a lunar month has 29 or 30 days because, one synodic month is about 29 and a half days. So if you want to round it to a full number of days, it would be either 29 or 30. That's not 24. That's more than 24. So I recall that even though there are 24 letters of the Greek alphabet that are used, there are 3 letters that are obsolete. So you have digamma, originally a W sound, a kopa, a kind of far back in the mouth K sound, and you have sampi, which we're not really sure the way it was pronounced, kind of probably changed from dialect to dialect. But these letters were only ever really used for numerical reasons, and even then only by like accountants, not by a lot of common people who were literate back then. So we have these 3 obsolete letters, which gets us 24 plus 3 is 27. So I considered also, well, they didn't have weeks back then. For us, we have 7-day weeks. That's how we divide up a month into 4 weeks. So you have, new to first quarter to full to third quarter, and the third quarter to new. But the ancient Greeks didn't classify a month like that. Instead, they broke a month down to 3 10-day periods. So you have the you have the waxing period, so from new to about a third of the way full. You have culminating in the middle, which was the full moon, and you have the waning period. So if I wanted to break this out, assume an ideal month is 30 days. That gives you 3 10-day periods. If I break up 27 into 3, well, that's 9 plus 9 plus 9. So I have this in place where I have each 10-day period getting 8 usual letters, 1 obsolete letter, and 1 letterless day. So for instance, in the first period of the month, we would have alpha being the day of the new moon, the day of the first sighting of the moon, I should say, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, digamma, the obsolete letter for that 10-day period, zeta, eta, theta, and then a blank day. The way I reckon this, the way I use this system is on the days that have the normal letters, those are days for ritual. So on the day of alpha, I make lunar offerings because alpha is associated with the moon. On the day of beta, I'd make offerings to Athena, or I would do zodiacal magic with Aries. On the obsolete days, because there's 1 obsolete day for each 10-day period, I give those to the dead. ancestors of kin, ancestors of profession, ancestors of religion, ancestors of the land or of culture, of society, and so forth. But I wouldn't do any other work.
Mhm.
And then on the letterless days, nothing at all. You could consider it an unlucky day, or consider it a day of rest, a weekend, as it were. But I just take that day to do nothing at all. And this system actually works fairly well on a month-to-month basis. Of course, there are months that have only 29 days, in which case I just lop off the last unlettered day from the last 10-day period. And then, boom, 29 days. Easy. That's the core idea of my Greek letter calendar. It gets, again, as you can probably guess, it gets more complicated the more you want to go. You can associate letters to months, letters to years, letters to whole eras if you want, based on how far you want to go in the future or the past. We don't have time to go over all that, but I have a whole free ebook about it.
Yeah.
It's like 600 some pages. It covers like the whole time period from like, I want to say 2015 to 2038 or something like that. It's free. It's on my website. You can get it.
Mm-hmm. No, it's very interesting because I think that, as you said, that the calendrical system in ancient times, it was extremely complicated, and the whole lunar calendar for the Greeks, or at least, again, every time I say the Greeks, it's really what we know of the Attic calendar. I am not going to be referencing stuff from that multi-volume tome that you mentioned.
It's a great read. Like, don't be wrong.
Sure,
you have the time. It's a fascinating read, but God, it's so dry and complicated.
Well, in any case, they in the Attic calendar, or at least what we know of it, or what I'm familiar with, there were certain days of the month that were associated with various gods and things like that. But it generally only covered like 1/3 of the month, if I recall, what it was, and it was mostly in the first half of the month, and that's great. I follow that in my personal practice. I follow some of that, and I make offerings specific for some of those deities on given days, though I don't follow the entire monthly calendar, precisely because it does sometimes get into the complex drift between our different forms of magic that we're practicing, and the ways that those ritual calendars would otherwise overwhelm us with too many things.
And yeah, like I like my system because my system will not match the Attic system. Like, it won't. Like, you have certain festivals held on a monthly basis in the Attic system that just are on completely different days in my system, and that's fine. Like, I'm not claiming to be an Attic substitution. It is a calendar system of its own, like completely detached and apart from any extant system we have. That's by design and by intent. So I don't want to replace the Attic calendar for those who want to keep using it. By all means, keep using it if you want. But yeah, it's the Attic calendar also only assigns certain days, and I'm a completionist. I like knowing if I want to do this random ritual, what's a good day to do it on, without resorting to hoary astrology, electional astrology. Is there, like, do I have like a dedicated time slot? Okay, this day of the month, boom, done. I have the decision already made for me. But I'm a completionist in organization, not necessarily a completionist in action. Because, yeah, if you look at this calendar from the night point of view and you say every day has a letter, every day has a bevy of gods, how am I at the time? That's just it. You don't. Like, maybe do one day a month for something big, and then do something different the next month on a different day, and that's fine. Like, that's something for us all to pay attention to. Don't overwhelm ourselves. It's so easy to let our work run away from us that way.
I don't know what you're talking about. I have never heard of such a thing. I am no.
Are you feeling attacked your own show? I apologize.
No, it is so appropriate. You have no idea. But then that actually, we're going to go away from Greek letters for 1 second, just because we're talking about calendar stuff and ritual planning things. And this was a question that I wanted to ask you the first time you were on the show, on my very first show, and I don't think we got to it. No, I'm sure we didn't get to it. You have a system of geomantic holy days, and I'd wanted you to kind of, if you could, I know we're shifting wildly from the Greeks now, but could you briefly describe, since we're talking about holy days and dedicated work and things like that, what those are to our listeners?
So that was an experiment, and that experiment has largely come to a close for me. And the idea was to have this whole geomantic spirituality You know, if I had a religious path based in geomancy, the divinatory art, and expanded it significantly, kind of like what some Arabic geomancers do and how they tie it into Islam today, what would it look for me? Well, unfortunately, based on how we keep time, there's no easy way to divide the year into sixteenths.
Mm-hmm.
You know, twelfths, sure, not a problem. Quarters, thirds, easy. Sixteenths, not so much.
Mm-hmm.
So I had this notion of, well, kind of taking inspiration from the pagan wheel of the year, you have quarter days and you have cross quarter days. And that's 8. So we can kind of take that system and just divide that up into, divide that into, halves again, 16.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But kind of associating a cross quarter day with a quarter day based on, say, element or, temperament, you can break that down from 8 into 4, 4 elements. And well, 4 elements, geomancy is essentially an elemental form of divination, in my view. And well, each individual geometric figure is based on the 4 elements, 4 rows of lines, 2 dots, 2 dots, 1 dot, and so forth. So I kind of tied into this lunch of quasi Abrahamic mythos, um, looking at the 4 elemental angels, Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, and Uriel, and then considering on top of that, what would 4 geomantic patriarchs be, the 4 forebears of geomancy? And if you look at some of the myths and origination stories of geomancy, especially in Islamic and Arabic literature, you often see geomancy associated with Daniel or Adam, the first man, sons with Idris, associated with Hermes Trismegistus, who more biblically is considered to be Enoch.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of took those 4 figures, keeping Enoch and Hermes Trismegistus separately, and considered them the 4 forebears of geomancy. And I essentially gave the 4 forebears to the cross quarter days and the 4 elemental angels to the quarter days. And those are my geometric holy days. That's really all there is to it.
And in what way would you say that it came to a close? What did you find about it that didn't work as well for you? I'm just curious.
My practice basically is kind of, I like the idea of it. It's a good idea, and maybe it's useful for someone else. But even though I kind of rebooted myself within the system, my practice just shifted in a different way, and I just don't make as much use of that as I thought I would.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good system. I like it. It's just I'm not getting mileage up at the time, so
Mm-hmm.
that's all. Like, I'm not saying it doesn't work. It totally works, but it's just I'm not working that right now.
So, okay. So in talking about, we've been talking about calendars, we've been talking about all the different, meanings of different letters and stuff like that. When it comes to your, we're talking more about calendrical work in a sense. How do you think about and conceptualize your process of like you were saying, like looking for dates and times when you are going to do certain rituals? Like, is there a form of divination that you go to in order to sort of divine when you should do workings? Or is that something that is based on time of year, just basically based on need? I'm just curious if there's a process to that.
I should say yes. It is a good bit of advice that we should all follow, that before any working we do, any spell, any ritual, we should always divine ahead of time to make sure, should I be doing this ritual? Should I be doing this ritual now? Do I have everything I need for this ritual? And for some ceremonies, I do that kind of ahead of divination for the stuff that needs to go right the first time. I make sure I dot all my I's, cross all my T's, make sure everything is in place, make sure all the spirits are happy before I continue, to make sure I can continue. I should say that. In general, I don't bother. Like, if I need to do something, I'm just going to do it. Like, in an ideal world, I would find an election, according to the rules of electoral astrology, find like a good, solid, stellar time. Make sure the planets are literally aligned the right way to get to ensure a good result of what I want to do. Or I would, consider, like my Greek letter calendar, consider the other influences, consider historical evidence for when certain rituals were done at certain times of the year or in certain contexts under certain needs. I would check that in a perfect world.
But when
But
does life actually work like that? Yeah.
exactly. And so most of the time I just can't be arsed. Like I'm tired. Like what day of the week is it? It's a Sunday. I'll do some solar stuff. Oh, it's not Sunday. Let's see. 3 hours from now is an hour of the sun. I'll take a shower and get ready for that. Like
Oh yeah. Yeah.
that's the most stuff. Like if I'm doing stuff of my own accord, if I'm working with a god, or if I'm making a formal petition to like one of my Orisha or one of my shrine in gods or spirits, like I'll go to them and I'll ask, hey, I need XYZ. Are you willing to do this? And if so, when, how, and what do you need of me in order to do it? So like I'll leave the matter up to them. And if they say hold off, more than happy to hold off because I have all the time in the world. If they say let's do it now, they got to say let's do it now. But
Yeah.
that's if I'm doing stuff under and with them. If I'm just doing stuff of my own accord, I get to it when I get to it.
Mhm. Yeah.
I should be
That
more
is an
rigorous than
important
that.
distinction because when you have that system for when you are working with those specific deities or those spirits, then they are in charge of the timing in a sense. So yeah, and I think that's important to keep in mind.
Like, for instance, I have a couple ceremonies I need to have myself with my God family, my religious community at some point. I'm in no rush, but I've been told by Arisha that I need to have them done. The question is when. I could, ascertain when by asking them, or I could just say, I'm going to wait until the need actually arises for it. Because a lot
Mhm.
of these ceremonies, you have one shot. Like once the ceremony is done, it's done. So I don't want to waste that. But other things like, okay, I know at some point I need to have a formal party for my godfather's, Orisha. I'll probably save it, A, when I have the money, so I can actually throw the party. B, I'll probably save it for, his initiation anniversary or the feast day of that Orisha, in September, which is a customary day to make offerings, petitions to that Orisha, so long as you don't have something more pressing that needs to happen before so then. So it really does depend on like the nature of the thing and, is it in the court of a god? Is it in my own court? How urgent is it? Because, you could have this whole system for deciding when you want to do stuff, how you want to do it. But at the crux of it all, the only time you really have is now. Like, do you want to do stuff now or not now? And if you need something now, you generally can't wait for a future time. Like, if it can, wait for that perfect time or as perfect as you can get it. Otherwise, just do it.
Mhm. Yeah. It's different, but it reminds me of the favorite parable of when was the first day, when was the best day to plant a tree 50 years ago, when is the second best day today. It is
Exactly.
true that there are perfect times, but sometimes you cannot wait for that perfect time, or trying to wait for the perfect time would actually be to the detriment of yourself or whatever the cause is.
Like with electoral astrology, you can like electoral astrology gets really intricate and you can like try to plan out in advance, the perfect election. For like, so I want to do a consecration for some Mercury talismans. What's a great time to do them? 5 years from now.
Mhm. Yeah.
Or like a Saturn talisman. Great time for Saturn talisman. 16 years from now. I don't have that kind of time. Like, I
Mhm.
will do it next Saturday, whatever. Like a lot of the rules you have in electoral astrology that you find like old texts like the Picatrix or any other number of electoral astrological texts, magical texts for creating talismans, they give you a best case scenario. You want to hit all these different criteria in order to get a good talisman. But in reality, you're not going to be able to hit all those criteria without waiting decades. So you try to hit the most important ones.
Mhm.
And once you just focus on the most important ones and kind of like deal with the rest on the side, then your opportunities expand exponentially. And that works great for specifically astrological magicians. I am not exactly an astrological magician. I probably said it before here, as a magician, I do astrology like how an engineer does math. Just enough to get by, and then I hired experts to do the rest. So for me, like if I know an election that's coming up, I'll try to make use of it. If it's not like at 2 o'clock in the morning on a weeknight, you know, I'm if that's like that, I'll have to think twice about it. But the way I kind of reckon it is People have been doing magic just fine without waiting for the perfect time. Timing is important. Never going to say otherwise. Timing is definitely important. And if you have the right time, it enables you to go so much easier and smoother with so much else. In lieu of that, throw more incense and prayer at it. Like, that's kind of my rule. Like, if I can't work the perfect time, I'll burn some more incense. If I have a crappy time, I'll burn even more incense and spend even more time in prayer. And I kind of make up the balance that way. I build up the power for the ritual that would have been there if it were perfect time. But because it's not perfect time, I need to put that extra energy into the ritual to get as good results. And it's kind of a trade-off. If you have the perfect time to make a talisman, you don't have to do much more than just literally drawing the talisman out, maybe breathing on it if you want to be fancy. If you don't have the perfect time, that's where you break up the altar and the candles and the incense and like the 15 pages of prayer, and it'll still work fine. So it depends on what you want to do, how long you want to wait, what you want to put into it. It all depends.
Yeah. But that also then comes down to the amount, it kind of relates to the amount of effort that you've put into learning about all these different details. Because if you don't know what makes up the perfect time, or all of these different things as that relates to the spirits that you're working with, then it's kind of hard to say that. And not to say that any of us ever reach the point where we have perfect knowledge. I know all of the correspondences now, but that you have that breadth of knowledge that at least allows you to plan for some of the variables, which I think, yeah.
And also, this doesn't even touch on the fact that there are plenty of kinds of magic that are not astrological in nature at all. And it's like, if something really needs an astrological influence, then yeah, I'll go with astrological methods of magic. But if it doesn't strictly need it, and if a good time for it isn't available, I'll use a different method entirely that has no bearing on astrology whatsoever. Because there are whole religions and whole forms of magic that don't look at the skies, that don't look at the stars and planets, and just don't care. And that's fine. So it's a entirely different system of magic you can kind of keep in your other pocket, so that when you can't reach for one, you just reach the other and you're still ready to go.
Yeah. So I had a question that kind of ties back to divination. You mentioned with the Greek divination, you mentioned how, if you needed to know which god, let's say, to petition for certain work or to have success with something, you could draw a letter and then know what god is associated with that. There we go. Are there other forms of divination that you might use, that you like to use, or ways that you combine divination into figuring out what kind of working you need to do for a goal or something like that? Is that something you go to geomancy for? Is that something that you just kind of figure out based on your knowledge of what you think would work well, or do you combine geomancy, other divination with that sometimes?
It really depends. As not all divination systems are equal. Some divination systems are better answering certain kinds of queries than others. Geomancy is really good for a lot, but it's not good for everything, despite what some people might claim. So with geomancy, I can definitely use that as an inspiration for what kind of ritual is needed, what should it be targeted at, where should it be done. I can totally do it that way. Greek alphabet oracle, I could probably get a good inclination of drawing from a single letter what gods I propitiate, or what force do I need to focus on. The number could indicate how many times I might need to do it, or how many things might be needed for it. Using a well-known proto-grimoire called the Granides, it's basically this index of plants and animals and stones and things you can do with it, arranged by letters of the Greek alphabet. So if I wanted to know the things to use for a ritual for something you do, I got the letter gamma. Well, I could go to the Granides and pull out all the information associated with gamma. So for instance, there's Glaucs, a type of small white owl, which is associated with Athena. There's Glaucos, a small common type of whitish gray fish. Gale, a weasel. So if I want to have like some weasel fur on hand, in order to work with that. I could use Glucosidae, peony, as a flower or an herb for my working. I could use Gnanthios, a hard granite-like stone, as a talisman base. All this could be done under the auspices of Aphrodite, because she's associated with Taurus, and Taurus associated with Gamma. or also Gaia, Earth, because Gaia is actually the name of the god associated with that oracle. So the number associated with gamma is 3. So I could do, say, 3 small little granite pebbles. I could dress around with peony flowers, asking Aphrodite to bless them in a working for whatever it was I might need to do. So yeah, you kind of associate all these things together in a really complex, yet also satisfyingly complete way
Mhm.
if you just dig in enough. And I kind of, now that I think about it, it's kind of similar with geomancy in a way. With geomancy, I just kind of probably talked about this before, but it gives you the answer up front in simple, clear, high level terms. And then you can dig in for as much detail that you want. It's kind of the same way with this Greek alphabet oracle stuff. It gives you the answer up front, and you can dig in as much as you want. And there's little judgment involved. I mean, when you're asking the gods judge for you. You don't judge the gods. The gods give you the answer. You just have to read into it more as you need to. So, I hadn't figured that out before. That's an interesting connection.
No, it's a
Thank you.
really interesting connection between those two forms. You're right, because it does it has that same kind of depth of being able to go into it in the same way, just in different forms, obviously. I want to switch gears. We're kind of in the geomancy realm, and this is not, well, I'm tying it into divination because we can talk about puer and puella, but you wrote a recent blog post about like gender in Hermeticism. And that instantly made me think of another question that I wanted to ask you last time, which we didn't get to, which was a blog post that you wrote earlier about, boy and girl, about puer and puella, and those like the conceptions of gender and things like that are mixed up with those two geomantic signs. And in your recent blog post, you talked about that as it relates more to Hermeticism itself, and also then kind of through that, a lot of ideas of magic that we have in the modern day. And this is a huge topic, which is, fraught with all sorts of stuff, obviously. But I think it's an important conversation, and I really appreciated that you brought it up. And it's something that my friend and I, who are co-high priestesses of our coven, talk about a lot, because we are Wiccans. We don't really generally use the word Wicca because we more use witchcraft, but it does come from that Wiccan basis, which has obviously it did have a lot of baggage around, gender ideas and male and female plurality and stuff like that. So it is something that we discuss a lot because we think it's very important to make sure that we have good understandings of this, so we're not perpetuating stereotypes or perpetuating old, like 19th century ideas, perhaps. But in any case, I wanted to kind of like have you kind of speak a little bit about how you see that with Hermeticism, and yeah, I'll stop there.
So, disclaimer: what I'm about to say only affects and is discussed within the context of classical Hermeticism. There are hundreds, if not dozens, different traditional systems that do have a system of gender or sex, based on how you want to view it, whether you want to take a modern approach of distinction between gender and sex, or a classical approach that doesn't. A lot of systems do have a notion of divine feminine or divine masculine, a divine polarity or binary in that case. Good for them, not going to touch them, different topic entirely. When it comes to Hermeticism, the reason why I wrote that series of posts about gender Hermeticism and gender in the Corpus Hermeticum specifically, because I kept getting ticked off at how many people kept trying to insist that the Hermetic law of polarity is a thing, when it's not. Like, it's BS from the Kabbalion. And as anyone who knows anything about me knows, I have no love for the Kabbalion. Period. I get that rant. I've written endlessly about it. I've ranted about it on Twitter and Discord. I don't need to say more about it, even though I want to. But suffice it to say, one of the issues I have with Kabbalion that crops its head up time and time again is that people insist that these hermetic laws are universals. They are laws when they're not. For me, something is a law is if it's general, if it can actually be seen in all things. And these people treat these things as if they are, and maybe some of them, sure. Cause and effect, Sure, that's a law. Like that's something you can actually see everywhere. Gender, I disagree. I don't see gender everywhere. Oh, well, male's active, female's passive. Why? Is giving birth passive? Tell any woman. Tell them.
Oh, yeah.
But like the notion that if you want to even root it in sex, oh well, a man puts semen into the woman. I'm gay. Like I'm not gonna do that ever. Like that's not a thing I'm gonna do. If you want to start resorting to sexual symbolism in order to talk about spiritual things, it has to work in a way for me, from my experiences. And straight sex metaphors don't work for me because I don't have straight sex because I'm gay. I have gay sex where you have two men and you don't have a fork and a knife there. You have two forks. Like the whole system is different. I wouldn't say two forks, two chopsticks. The metaphor is completely different then.
Yeah.
It is not a universal, generalizable thing. And that's just for me. And I'm, by all accounts, cisgender. What about for transgender people? What about agender people or genderqueer people, where you even have notions of male or female, or you have some mix of both, or you have neither or something else entirely? These notions just don't apply generally. They are good and useful metaphors for most people. I'm not going to deny that, cishet people are the most common people out there. Like, it's a thing. I'm not angry about it. But just because it's common doesn't mean it's universal.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
that's where I find the issue, because people treat something that's common to be universal, and I don't see that working. So I wrote these series of posts, these two posts about gender and Hermeticism, actual Hermeticism, not Kabbalion Hermeticism, um, to actually talk about where and how gender and or sex appears in the Corpus Hermeticum and the Stoian fragments and other Hermetic texts, or rather where they don't appear,
Yeah.
and then expand on what they actually are doing when they are discussed. And it has nothing to do with spirituality. It's all about the body. I mean, yes, we do draw a distinction between gender and sex nowadays, but classically they didn't really. Or if they did, not nearly in the same terms we do nowadays. For them, it was rooted in physical bodies. And we talk about stuff that doesn't have a physical body. We talk about stuff that comes before the notion of bodies were a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then the notion of sex and therefore gender kind of goes moot. That's kind of where my position is.
Yeah.
So, and again, it's still a place for useful debate. Like, I know I'm not the final word on it, even though I want to be. Um, I'm not the final word on that. And again, that's all just within the context of Hermeticism. Other religions, other traditions, I'm not going to touch. They have it useful, good for them. Great. But for Hermetic stuff, it has no place. So that was really the origin of that whole series of rants.
Mm-hmm. No, I think
And
it's so important.
and again, that's just for me, because again, I don't see these metaphors of, male female playing out in my life or my work. Other people can try to map things to that metaphor. I won't. And honestly, I think it's a hassle to try to map everything to that male female dichotomy. I think it's a hassle. I think it's a lot of wasted energy. We can just drop it and just look at things in their own framework, in their own context, and you can get a lot further, a lot easier, with a lot less spilled breath, ink, and energy. So,
Well, yeah, it's as if it's uh, the whole passive versus active has, ever since I was like 12 years old and first reading my Wicca books, has bothered me because it doesn't. There's so many issues there.
I mean, let's be honest. The only reason why people say male equals active equals passive is A, because missionary sex is the only proper kind of sex there is, obviously, and B, because some old dude in Greece said that because they thought that women didn't have souls, and we've just been running with it ever since.
I'm so
Like,
sad that I don't. It's still a problem for me, but I managed to get along somehow.
well, it's because your lack of a beard. If you had a beard, you have a soul,
Ah, I
obviously.
forgot. No, but it's a really, I think it's a fascinating discussion, and one that's really, really important, because like you said, you are talking, specifically about the context of Hermeticism. And I think it is important to like define terms and say, this is not like we're trying to make universal statements that apply to all religions everywhere. But Hermeticism honestly has had a huge impact on a lot of aspects of occultism and the modern occult world. So it's important to kind of dig into that. So I will be linking to those posts for people and encouraging people to read it. And if you disagree, to encourage, I guess, to argue with you, because I'm sure it'd be a fascinating discussion. But I just think it's important to bring these things up. And I'm a cisgender woman, it's not really my place to be trying to speak about things that I don't experience personally, but I think that all of us have some experience of this gender conversation happening. And when it's in occultism, it's important for us to see how that impacts our divination, how it impacts our magic, how it impacts how we're thinking about and framing ideas and discussions. Because otherwise, if we don't interrogate that, then it's just going to come through in ways we're not aware of, which is not good magic, honestly. I think.
Because you're tapping into all these myths and very low level understandings of the cosmos from a human perspective, and if you aren't aware of that, you're letting them. It's basically letting the shadow run free at that point, and you do that at your own risk.
Yeah, that's very true. And to tie it back to divination, because I did want to ask, you had a fascinating description of puer and puella. And one thing that you brought up was that those names, like I have always known those, as puer and puella, but you pointed out, and it is in the Skinner book, like you said, that those names, there are many other names for those signs. Can you just briefly describe what we're talking about there?
So when we talk about geometric figures, it's common in a lot of English or Anglophone texts to talk about the geometric figures in terms of their Latin names. Laetitia, Tristitia, Via, Populus, Puer, Puella, and so forth. And it assumes that there's this universal, only this one set of names. But historically, different texts often had different names. Like Populus, 2222, was sometimes called duplex via, because via was 1111. So if you have 111 and double it to be another 111, you have 2222. Okay, sure, fair. But if you look throughout the history of geomantic literature, you do see different names that kind of all touch on the same ideas. So if you want to rename the figures, I mean, it might be a little bit more difficult to understand you, but it's not like you're alone. We assume there's one because of the centralization of a lot of occult literature and the standardization of a lot of practices nowadays. But that's largely an artifice of our modern society and culture and technology. Historically, things are a lot more decentralized. You had individual traditions spring left and right, and things can get a lot more varied a lot more quickly. So, okay, fine. If you have your own little naming system, by all means, have that. And in that light, I kind of considered what we might rename the figures puer, boy, and puella, girl. Because, again, it doesn't sit entirely right or well with me that there's this inherent gender in the very figures themselves. I mean, we do see it play out in those terms because of how certain biologies and phenotypes do play out. Okay, sure, along with cultural notions that are very long-standing. So, in light of that, and also in light of how our understanding of gender is changing and evolving and adapting, and how people are becoming increasingly freed from rather binding notions of those, what would different names these figures be? Well, in my meditations and contemplations of the figures and education and reading of these figures, Puer the boy, reckless, brash, all things a young boy would do. Luke Skywalker in episode 4. The young hero marching off to save the world. Dan the torpedoes full speed ahead. The figure of getting stoked. And you have Puella, who in my meditations is this, woman, my meditations, because that's just how literature talks about her, in this temple house, inviting me in, treating me well, showing off all these nice things and leading me back out at the proper time. So to play off the words puer and puella, I had the solution of renaming them to be hero and host, which I think describes the attitude and energy of those figures, what they do, just in a non-gendered way. And let's be honest, if we take a gendered approach to it, if we were to refer to a hero, we're probably going to use male pronouns. And while you can have a host, we generally want to think of adding the extra syllable to that, hostess. So I'm just really taking the gender out of it and getting to more of the heart of what that energy is. avoiding the use of gendered language, but still maintain the accuracy of what it is I'm trying to describe. Because clearly, women can be heroes too, and men can be hosts too. Like, it's not about what you have in your pants. It's not about the identity you want to propose. It's about the job you're doing, it's about the energy you're bringing to the table. You know, whatever else doesn't really matter in that case, in my opinion.
Mhm.
So that was kind of where I was taking that idea. And while I still conventionally refer to the figures as puer and puella to maintain that standardization and communicability with other people, in my mind, I'm still thinking nowadays more as host and hero.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think that that's a beautiful way of breaking down what the figure is, saying. And as you said in your meditations, those are the images that you saw. So there's something that about those names that works. It has worked in our society for a long time, which means it's not like false or wrong, to use them if it doesn't work. Or maybe it is a little better to use your host and hero idea because it gives more play and more room for that. But it's nice that then to have the flexibility to see it as both and to be able to choose one under contexts that make more sense. And I think it also gets more to the heart of what the figure is trying to say. And so we could do that with many other, forms of divination, I'm sure, of like looking at what is the essence of this figure? What is it saying to us? And then we don't have to get wrapped up in necessarily the cultural connotations of it, although they're there and they're going to influence what we see, obviously.
Like, we can't escape this context.
Of
Like,
course, yeah.
as while I would love a system of magic and divination that's completely detached from gender, I know that gender really works for some people, and maybe the system isn't great for them. That's fine. Stick to gender if it works for you. I'm not going to take it away from you. That's your thing. But also, I am a product of my culture, a product of my time period, a product of my language, a product of everything that has produced the continuous conscious experience that is Sam Block. And it is my job to be aware of that, to learn about that. Even if I can't fully separate myself from that, I should at least try to not be unconscious of what's feeding into these images that appear in my head, the things I translate into images in my head or metaphors. So I can't, I don't think that I'm at the right point, whether as an individual or whether we are as a culture, to fully divest ourselves of gender. It is, for better or for worse, too ingrained in our cultural knowledge, in our consciousness, for thousands of years across many different cultures. It manifests, but all in different ways. I do want to point that out. Gender manifests in different ways, in different cultures. So it's not a universal there either.
Yeah.
But it still is there. And so it's still going to affect me in some way. I just have to be aware of that and then understand that that's my first instinct because of how I was raised. Now, what do I think? What do I interpret that as? Accounting for that, but also based on other knowledge I have since learned.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's
And
my approach, at least.
yeah, I think that also kind of goes back to whenever we're working with gods that come from other cultures. I mean, we're talking about with the Greek letter system as well. It's like, well, we come from a certain culture. I'm not a Greek speaker, certainly not an ancient Greek speaker. Therefore, I have layers of my own culture and my own expectations that go into my interpretations, my way of dealing with the gods and these systems of divination that's just there. I'm not going to get rid of it. There's no way that I can because it's who I am. But I can interrogate, I can try to understand and get, further into the layers of it, which will then inform, how I'm interacting with those layers in a better way. But to try to disassociate yourself from it would be kind of maybe not so healthy either.
It's kind of, I kind of want to tie this back to a good approach I have reading from old books. Reading the Corpus Hermeticum, which was written more or less between 100 to 300 BC, or sorry, CE, and in Roman period Hellenistic Egypt. You can read it as you are today, without having ever read any other archaeological information or philosophical books. You can just read the Corpus Hermeticum, and you can probably get a lot out of it. But if you read it naively, you miss out on all the connotations of the word. You miss out on what was being said to the audience of that book as was written in the time period and culture and geographic area it was written. A lot of people nowadays will read about these 7 governors in book 1 of the Corpus Hermeticum and wonder, what are those? Well, to a person back then, it was immediately clear that they were talking about the 7 planets. But because the word planet isn't explicitly used and we're not used to thinking of planets as cosmic governors, that I wouldn't say hidden, but metaphoric meaning may go over some people's heads.
Mhm.
Just as you would not expect a teacher to come to your house to teach you, you would go to your teacher's house to learn from your teacher, to sit at their feet and to learn from them. Likewise, it's on us, it's our duty to go to the house of these books, of these systems, of these traditions, and learn within the context of that book, of that teacher, of that tradition, to understand from their point of view what it is that's trying to be communicated or taught. That way, you're leaving behind your preconceptions and you're learning about things as they were taught, as they were learned themselves back then by people before you. That way, when you go back home, you can integrate that and recontextualize it while keeping the message clear. Because if you have things going to your house first, you may not get the entirety of that message. It's a naive way of learning.
Mhm.
So I think being able to contextualize things properly in an appropriate way, and then keeping the message clear from that, even if you have to recontextualize it later, I think that's a good approach to anything nowadays.
Yeah, that is beautifully put. I really, really like that description of that. That is so appropriate, I think. Well, we are reaching the end of our interview, and I wanted to ask you. We've gone through what a crazy year.
A
So we're
lot,
taking this
God.
in May of 2021. Just in case people are listening way after. Yeah, crazy year. And I wanted to just kind of ask you. You are a return guest, so I usually ask at the end, what is some advice that you would give people, that you want to leave people with, like something that you think is helpful to people? Is there anything in particular that has changed for you over the last year, or would your advice be kind of the same? And if so, what would you like people to pay attention to in their magic or in their lives, do you think is very helpful?
I have no idea what I said last time, if I said anything at all about this. So forgive me if I might repeat myself. But
That's it.
let's take the last year into account. For me, my experience, I'm technically on hiatus from doing readings for people because I realized that I was getting worn down, not from doing readings specifically, just from everything. The stress of the weight of the world, even in here, like my own little comfortable bubble of existence where I have been safe and responsible and diligent about making sure I'm okay, like that alone, the weight of that has just seemed to increase and balloon.
Mm.
And so I had just for my own mental health, just stop doing readings, stop doing client work people, because even though I know I'm good at it, I can't do it right now. If I were to force myself to do it, I wouldn't be good at it. And I don't want to, charge my clients and just phone it in. Like that's not what I want to do. It's disrespectful to them. It's disrespectful to my art. I'm not going to do that. And we all see these memes from Tumblr and Twitter about taking it easy and forgiving yourself because this is not a normal time. And it's true. It's not a normal time. We all have to make our own normalcy. We all have to recalibrate ourselves and adjust. We have to have both a short-term view and a long-term view. You know, consider California right now. California is what's said to be a period of drought, constant wildfires and so forth. But this is happening year in, year out. The climate is changing. Rainfall patterns are shifting. The geography has changed where there are no more floodplains and no more swamps to collect water. Instead, it all just becomes floods and goes out to sea, which leaves the ground barren. Is it really a drought at this point?
Mhm.
Could you say that the Sahara Desert is a drought climate? Or is it just a desert? We may not think this is normal. And a lot of people have, caught flack for using the phrase new normal. But I think it's important for us to recognize, is a certain set of contexts or situations or circumstances, is that temporary? And if so, how do you accommodate that? Are they going to be long term? If so, how do you accommodate that? Giving some thought to where we find ourselves today in our lives, in our social groups, in our professions, in our world, in our climates, in our countries, whatever, take some time for yourself and consider, how are you doing? And how are you doing it? And is that sustainable? Not just climate or economically or ecologically, but is that sustainable for you? Can you keep up doing things what you have been? And if so, how can you keep doing them to ensure that it's not going to be a drain on you? And if not, what do you need to change? How long do you need to change it for? And then always try to find your own balance. And, you know, that phrase, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. It sounds so dire, but it's still such good advice. Try to find your balance. Always find your balance first and foremost. And then once you have that, see, is that a good way to keep your balance? And if so, how can you rebalance to keep your balance later? Probably got a little high level and heavy handed there at the end, but
No,
that's kind of like my own experience the past year.
Yeah, no, I think that's excellent advice, and I'm sure people will think a lot about that. I will. I know that we've had
So
time,
sorry,
but there's always more to do, especially in coming to our own sense of balance. So, yeah. Well, thank you, Sam. I have,
thank you.
As I knew I would, obviously, I really enjoyed this, and I really appreciate your time. So thank you so much.
It has been an honor and a privilege and a pleasure. So thank you.
Wait a second. I'm not letting you go until you tell us, how do people find you? And can you just tell us if you have anything coming up? You said that you're not doing readings right now, but I know that you are doing some courses, and I wanted to know if basically people just find you on the Digital Ambler site.
Yes. So my blog, my website, https://digitalambler.com. You can find my ebooks. You can find my 2 free courses. There are some agreements you have to agree to, but beyond that, they are free of charge, free of cost. I'm not doing readings right now, but once I'm ready to do so again, I'll make an announcement there. That's kind of like my home base online. You can also find me on Twitter at Polyphonies. You can find me on Facebook, Digital Ambler. Yeah, that's how you can find me online.
All right, that is wonderful, and I'll link to all of that. So thank you, Sam.
Thank you. Thank you again. Everyone do well. So thank you again.
Falconries cross many moons day. Don't you dare silence the song in my head. The flowers are broken, the fallen paths bare. Don't speak to me, darling, till blood lays his hair. How long was the earth there?